Okay, I think we'll get started. Good morning. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest edition of the FCM Collective, from National Adaptation Strategy to Local Climate Resilience. FCM is pleased to be collaborating with our partner, the Cooperators, today to present this discussion. So my name is Andrea Boyd. I am the Director of Sponsorship and Events at FCM, and we're so pleased to be convening such an important and timely conversation today. As we move forward with our commitment to reconciliation, I want to acknowledge that I am at FCM's head office today, located on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. As an organization, we endeavor to unlearn colonial mindsets and practices, grow in knowledge, and adapt ways of working. As we continue to build meaningful relationships, we recognize the historic and ongoing contributions of Indigenous peoples, and we honor their leadership and partnership in shaping and strengthening communities across this country. I welcome all of you to acknowledge the land that you're joining from today. Today, we have members and colleagues, including municipal, not-for-profit, academic, policy, and private sector leaders joining us from coast to coast to coast. We have people registered from Port Moody, BC, from Ville de Laval, and from North Rustico, PEI. And I may be throwing out a controversial statement, but I do think the best lobster rolls in PEI are found in North Rustico. So it is this spectrum of perspectives that we convene that will enable us to do the critical work that we have in front of us. So before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items to mention. This session is available with simultaneous interpretation. To participate in French, if you can click on the globe icon in the bottom tab and select the French option. If you do not select the language, you'll hear the live audio in English. If you would like to ask a question, as you can see, we're convening in meeting format, so it might be tricky to see the hand raised function. So please pop a question that you may have in the chat, and we will endeavor to get to as many of those questions as possible today. This is a 60-minute webinar, so we will we'll try to keep to time and keep everyone on time. I would now like to introduce the moderator, who will be doing just that. And we're joined today by Councillor Jeffery. She's from the town of Collingwood, Ontario. Councillor Jeffery is in her 5th term as a municipal politician, and she's also on the FCM Board of Directors. As director, she just recently returned from Jordan, where she traveled with an FCM delegation to see our international programs at work. And we are supporting municipal government capacity building in countries right around the world. So over to you, Councillor Jeffery, to get us underway. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Andrea, and welcome everyone. We are so pleased that you were able to join the webinar today. And as you see, it's being recorded and it will be available in the future for your interested colleagues and those who were unable to attend today. So this past November 2022, the federal government announced its $1.6 billion National Adaptation Strategy, which the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, FCM, welcomed, as it signaled a meaningful progress toward a whole of Canada approach to climate mitigation and adaptation. And the federal plan had been 2 years in the making. The announcement included a significant investment of $530 million to support, accelerate, and scale up community-based climate adaptation initiatives in the existing Green Municipal Fund, GMF, administered by FCM, which brings the GMF endowment to $2.1 billion. There was an additional $491 million top up for the government's Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund, fondly known as DMAF, and the investment was reportedly completed with several other budget line items, including $164 million to improve Canadians' access to flood mapping, $30 million to protect against extreme heat, $41 million for a pilot program to improve resilience in northern and coastal communities, and $70 million for a national science assessment to improve climate data. So it has also been reported that the strategy was well received by Canada's property and casualty insurance industry, and the Canadian Underwriter reported that the Insurance Bureau of Canada hailed the initiative as brave and ambitious. So CBC News reported that the strategy envisions a country prepared to deal with the worst impacts of climate change. So today's conversation will delve into the growing opportunity to reduce risk and increase resiliency in our communities. Our panelists will offer their perspectives on the new National Adaptation Strategy and discuss the new funding and innovation support to tackle climate risks. So each of our panelists will be introduced and given 4 to 5 minutes each to give opening remarks. And following that, I will lead a roundtable of questions and discussion with our panelists. And if I do my job, we will have about 15 minutes to respond to some of your questions placed in the chat. So let us begin. And our first panelist today will be Sarah Miller. And Sarah has a policy background focused on climate policy, conservation, and natural resource management, and the clean economy. She has worked as an independent consultant, providing research, policy advice, and strategic planning services to nonprofit organizations and government. She previously worked as Director of Policy and Strategy for the BC Greens in the BC Legislature. And Sarah holds an MPhil in International Relations from the University of Oxford and a BSc from the London School of Economics. Sarah, welcome, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Kathy, and thanks for having me. It's great to be here and to be able to talk about this strategy with all of you and to be alongside Julie and Dawn on this panel. So thanks for having me. I'll just speak briefly about our thoughts on the National Adaptation Strategy at a high level in terms of the framework that it provides for adaptation planning across the country, and then we can get into some more of the specifics. So I'll say, to echo Kathy's point, I think we really welcome this strategy because it marks a potential turning point in Canada's response to climate change. Until very recently, until last year when the strategy was announced, we were really lagging behind peer countries across the world in lacking a coordinated national approach to adaptation, because many of you on the call know it's really been pretty ad hoc and decentralized. A lot has obviously come down to local governments who are on the front lines of responding to climate impacts, but we've really lacked sort of a strategic framework for action at the federal level. And that, I think, is the really key point about this National Adaptation Strategy. The funding is one aspect, and I think actually the funding, once you look at the timelines that it's spread over, there's a fair bit more to do in terms of closing the funding gap on adaptation, though, you know, the minister framed the funding as a down payment. So if we're looking at it as a down payment, I would say it's a good thing, but definitely not done with funding adaptation nationally. But the key thing about the National Adaptation Strategy from our perspective is that it's moved away for the first time from this approach we've had to having pretty high level sort of aspirational documents at the provincial and federal level for adaptation that don't really guide planning in a strategic way. So the National Adaptation Strategy, for the first time, doesn't only have these sort of high level aspirational goals, it also sets medium-term objectives under each goal, as well as critically targets that are quite specific and measurable, and often the targets are quantitative. So they set specific targets for specific years to improve resiliency across the 5 systems that the strategy is organized under. So for us, that's really the key point, and the thing that makes this strategy have so much potential in guiding this whole of society approach in a way that sets, you know, all levels of government up to tackle the biggest risks facing communities in a, you know, more clearly risk-based and ultimately more effective way. I'll say also, you know, the National Adaptation Strategy is still under development. So we saw the draft strategy that the federal government released at the end of last year. It's still subject to comment. So we're going to see, you know, where they land on some of these details in terms of what the targets actually look like after consultation with other levels of government. So hoping that we end up you know, not too far away from the path that they've chosen, with having these really specific and measurable targets to drive progress. And the other key thing I think that the National Adaptation Strategy brings is it outlines a monitoring and evaluation system. So it outlines a way to measure progress and track progress and create some accountability for the federal government in hitting these targets that they've set out, and working with other levels of government to do that in a way that works for communities. So they've committed to updating the strategy on a 5-year timeline, which we think is fairly critical for adaptation. So much of this work is new, and so much of our understanding is evolving about risk, about how it's manifesting in communities, and about the most effective adaptation interventions to address it. So, this isn't the only shot at getting this right. It's important, but we can also continue to update and plan for an even stronger strategy a few years down the line. So I'll leave it there for now for my initial remarks and pass it back to you, Kathy. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sarah, and we look forward to pursuing some of your comments in the questions. So our second panelist is Julie Wright, and Julie took on the role of Director at Partners for Action in December of 2020, and previously she led Waterloo Global Science Initiative, WGSI, through its startup phase to successfully launching a decade-long summit series that tackled global decarbonization, the redesign of secondary education, the acceleration of global energy access, and the implementation of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, in Canada. So prior to working at WGSI, she spent 10 years in communications and public affairs roles for companies, clients, and campaigns in the tech, cultural, and nonprofit sectors at the forefront of sector disruption. And if that isn't enough, Julie is also the Ward 7 Councillor for the City of Waterloo. So welcome, Julie.
Thank you so much, Kathy, and thank you everyone for inviting me to be part of today's conversation. I'm in Waterloo, which seems obvious with the University of Waterloo and City of Waterloo affiliations. This is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and the Neutral Peoples, and we're situated on the Halteman Tract. So I just want to start off by saying that when I wear my Partners for Action hat, Partners for Action is a research initiative at the University of Waterloo that focuses on flood risk and resilience and empowering Canadians to be flood ready. So when I think about wearing that hat, I'm obviously thinking about how climate adaptation and natural hazard response come together through this new strategy, the National Adaptation Strategy. This is a conversation that's long overdue. I mean, we've been kind of holding these two things separately for quite a long time. Thinking about our natural hazard response, whether it's wildfire or flooding or the wind events that we've been experiencing, or say the hurricane response that Eastern Canada recently experienced. We've been holding these things quite separately, and maybe fooling ourselves that climate change wasn't quite here yet, but it is. It's absolutely here, and we see that through the severity of the events. Just last year, between two of the events that we experienced, the major storm front that came through Ontario and Quebec, and then Hurricane Fiona, we had two events land in the top 10 ever for Canada in terms of insured loss. And those are $2 billion events. So when you think about this fund that's associated with the National Adaptation Strategy, we have a lot of work to do. And I think the main point here is that 80% of our population lives in urban settings. We're linked together through infrastructure, and our infrastructure is really vulnerable to climate change. So if we don't get on to climate adaptation, we're going to see effects to our GDP. We're going to see the further erosion of our infrastructure. We know, FCM has this stat about there being a $123 billion infrastructure gap in Canada, and that's been downloaded to municipalities over time. So when I wear my City of Waterloo hat, I'm thinking a lot about how climate change impacts our infrastructure, our city infrastructure. And how do we start making the case for that? And I think that's where the National Adaptation Strategy becomes a really excellent rhetorical tool for us. I mean, we've had the Sustainable Development Goal framework that many of you are now familiar with, and we have a set of indicators. So there's 17 goals, there's 169 targets, there's 232 indicators. It's an all of society framework. So there's a role for everybody to play within the SDGs. The National Adaptation Strategy is similar, where it's asking everyone to play a role. And so it becomes an entryway for more people to come into this climate adaptation discussion, especially on the infrastructure side. And with infrastructure investment comes a lot of money. So that's just sort of a little bit of the framing that we're bringing to flood risk resilience these days. The other thing that I think is equally important is the idea that within our communities, there are people who will be more impacted by climate change than others. And so part of this positioning, again, the all of society approach is that everyone has a role to play. And we need to make sure that people have a chance to move out of the states of vulnerability that they're persistently in. And a lot of that is, again, linked to infrastructure. So if we're creating infrastructure that thinks about the people who will be most affected by climate change first, then we may be able to mitigate some of the long-term trauma and impacts from climate change. So these are all things that need to be wrapped into our adaptation strategies as we move forward. And then Partners for Action is hopefully bringing some tools to the table to help with that work. So, you know, one of the things that we've been working on just over the last couple of months is a report on buying out the floodplain. So how do we actually move people out of the way of harm? And there are communities that can't bear the repeat events, flood events in their communities. And so they really need to look at property buyouts as a strategy. Another project that we have coming to the table is to look very closely at social vulnerability, which is a temporal state. It's not a permanent label for any one demographic of people. It's a state that you move in and out of, and climate change really exacerbates that vulnerability. So by creating a social vulnerability index, we have a chance to take a data-informed approach, and then layer on top the different climate hazards to see who and where will people be most affected by climate change. So there's a lot of factors here to pull together. And again, just going back to this idea of an all of society approach, it's incredibly important that we form the right kinds of partnerships, that we start opening up the channels for more money to flow into this process, because we're really at risk. That's just sort of our current state right now in Canada. Is we really are carrying a lot of risk.
All right. Okay, thank you, Julie, for making those initial connections, and we'll chat a little bit more later on. So our third panelist, rounding out this awesome group, probably needs no introduction, but Don Iveson. He served as Edmonton's 35th mayor from 2013 to 2021, with a guiding leadership principle to make things better for the next generation. So this long-term view is now embedded in Edmonton's Smart Growth City Plan, City Council's Energy Transition Strategy, and Edmonton's nation-leading climate resilience citywide flood mitigation strategy. So since retiring from City Hall, Don continues to live in Edmonton. He works part-time with cooperators as executive advisor for climate investment and community resiliency. Don is also ramping up Civic Good, a public policy advisory practice working on climate, housing, governance, and civic innovation projects with like-minded clients ranging from startups to governance. He has accepted an appointment as a School of Cities Canadian Urban Leader at the University of Toronto, and he volunteers as board co-chair of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. So welcome, Don, and we're looking forward to your initial comments today.
Well, thank you, Councillor Jeffery, and it's a treat, as always, to share the stage with Julie and Sarah. We work closely at Cooperators with our friends at Partners for Action and the Canadian Climate Institute and FCM, and with many other partners as a convener in this space. So thank you to FCM for convening us for this important conversation. Thank you to all of you for taking some time out of your day to tune in to understand the risks and opportunities around dealing with climate change, and particularly the adaptation imperative that as has been laid out is definitely upon us. You know, in my own journey in public service, we saw repeated severe convective storms in Edmonton that started to expose some of the deficiencies and inadequacies in our drainage infrastructure. And that happened throughout the 14 years that I was at City Hall, but it kept particularly hitting the parts of the city I represented as a city councillor and the neighborhood my parents have lived in for 50 years and that I grew up in. So it was hitting close to home, and it was clear to us, partly as a more northerly community, that these shifts were climate related and that they were going to get more severe. So not only did we have to think about asset management with our aging and inadequate and undersized infrastructure, we needed to think about overhauling it for the storms of tomorrow. And so that represented ultimately a huge opportunity to do some design thinking, to think about nature-based solutions, to think about whole of society partnerships, and to ultimately take a risk-based approach to where to start and how to prioritize and what to build. And so that led to some work that's been widely recognized that I think, you know, what I'm passionate about doing is replicating and expanding, not one for one, because I think the solutions in coastal communities, the solutions in Indigenous communities, the solutions for rural, remote, and Indigenous communities may all be different, but we're all in this together now in Canada, and the National Adaptation Strategy has driven that conversation, and FCM exists to knit together all of those different community perspectives that are going to be impacted. And really the first step is understanding risk. And that's one of the things that brings cooperators here as experts in risk from the property and casualty insurance business. But equally, if not more so, and we work closely with the Insurance Bureau of Canada, we sit at a table that includes FCM called Climate Proof Canada, which did quite a bit of advocacy around the National Adaptation Strategy. And so some of those whole of society partnerships already exist between insurers, financial experts, disaster response agencies, academic experts like Julie's team, research experts like Sarah's team, and of course FCM. And so that convening's been happening for some time, and I think had a huge impact on the National Adaptation Strategy. So rest assured, this is not the first conversation for insurers looking at these issues, not the first conversation for FCM looking at these issues. And in fact, we've been talking for some time about the perils and the challenges that are upon us, but also the opportunity to do things differently. So, and cooperators particularly shows us with, as I've been delighted to discover, an awful lot of values alignment with FCM and with local government. So being the mothership of the co-op movement, owned by credit unions and cooperatives from coast to coast to coast, you know, we really do feel linked to the communities that we serve and the members who in turn own our organization. And our purpose is nothing less than financial security for Canadians and our communities. And that's interpreted very broadly to include how can we be resilient to the climate perils that threaten our economic security in our communities and in our households and in our businesses. And our vision is to be a catalyst for a resilient and sustainable society. And that's what brings us into this work, into this continuing partnership with FCM, and into these relationships with other folks working in this space. But I want to emphasize that it's not just as insurers and as risk experts, but also as investors. Cooperators has itself a fairly large bunch of funds accumulated over the years on behalf of its members, and it has seen fit to invest that on an impact basis in affordable housing solutions, often along with the co-op housing community, as well as climate change mitigation initiatives, lots of renewable energy and building retrofit initiatives. And Cooperators has a very, very ambitious goal to deploy 60% of its $12 billion through its institutional investment arm into impact-based investments. And one of the areas where we see an opportunity to go from more than 20%, which is already a nation-leading impact investment ratio, to 60%, is investments in community resilience. And that's one of the things that brings us here and into this conversation, is trying to identify opportunities to partner with communities to advance their resilience investing objectives where there's a known risk and where some offset can be identified that makes everybody whole. Because it is our view that while, you know, substantially more investment is needed in the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund, and in asset management investment in communities across this country, that putting it all on governments alone is not likely to get us where we need to get to. Even the federal government, armed with the money press, probably isn't equal to the task on its own. And even if they did spend tens of billions of dollars on this infrastructure, that doesn't necessarily mean that it would go to the most efficient places with the best intelligence with respect to de-risking and with the right adjustments to it around equity that Julie was mentioning. And so again, a whole of society approach means that investors and private sector interests need to also be at the table to help best prioritize those investments. And just to give an example around that, you know, to expand on what Julie was saying, we do need a math around floodplains, because some floodplains, it may make economic sense to protect them with earthworks or other public works, a mixture of gray and green infrastructure that allows them to be more flood resilient, recognizing in a catastrophic circumstance they may still flood, but that's what insurance is for the truly catastrophic. Unfortunately, at the moment right now, insurance is either unaffordable or unavailable for too many Canadians in floodplains who are being repeatedly hit by more and more severe weather. And those are the instances where folks are, you know, essentially getting wiped out over time as provinces cap their payouts. And that's a very rough way of establishing the math for managed retreat. But it does at least start a conversation about what would it take to rally together through collective action, whether it's through municipality or potentially through a cooperative, to establish a piece of public works infrastructure that might actually protect those communities. And so ultimately, those are pricing activities, they're market-related activities, but then it comes back to municipalities potentially playing a critical role in implementing that infrastructure by collecting some of the funds, say through tax increment financing. So if property values can be restored in a floodplain through the development of a berm or a dike that actually protects those communities, and restores their property value, then a TIF, for example, could work very, very well as a proxy for the economic benefit that is conferred on those assets and those properties by protecting them. And where it can get more interesting is that if the infrastructure consortium that builds that dike is prepared to take some risk and underwrite its performance against certain projected climate risk scenarios, then you can get some risk transfer and some performance and some long-term maintenance involved, and those partnerships form the basis that become attractive for private capital to be deployed. So again, if the federal government is able through things like DMAF to fund the things that don't have an obvious payback, there's going to be no shortage of projects that come forward from not just municipalities, but, you know, port authorities and industrial complexes and all kinds of other property-based and land-based activities that are going to need to be hardened against all the risks that we've talked about, and not just water risks, but heat, fire, drought, you know, all the perils that are already coming at us. And sadly, even despite our best efforts, likely to get more severe in the coming years. So, but there is hope, because there are folks trying to solve for this at the whole of society level. And that's what's represented on this panel and in the work that we've been doing with FCM so far. And I'll say that we're in talks with more than 20 communities directly or through some work we're doing with ICLEI around their resilience program to identify projects that have those paybacks and are ripe for private investment and multi-stakeholder partnership in order to actually attack that risk in a meaningful way and improve literally the resilience of Canadians and their families and their property and their businesses and their communities.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Don. Those are great. And so they've set us up for the questions that we're going to entertain in our roundtable with the panelists right now. And so question number one, we'd like to pose to Sarah. And I think we've heard quite a bit about it, but I think there's some other information we could use is why does this work of adaptation matter? Sarah?
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, Julie and Don already spoke to many aspects of this. I think, pointing to different tangible examples for why we can't continue to kind of fall behind in adaptation planning. I want to recognize that for a lot of the people on this call, adaptation is far from the only thing that you think about, whereas I think it's the main thing that people like me and Don and Julie with one of her hats on thinks about. So there's obviously, major competing priorities for spending. And, what we've found at the Institute through some research that we've done is that adaptation is really better seen as an investment rather than a cost, because of the multiples that you get in terms of the return on investment. So we found that, for every dollar spent on proactive adaptation, not just reactive cleaning up after disasters, but proactive adaptation, you can get between $13 and $15 returned once indirect benefits are included. So the direct benefits themselves are compelling in terms of avoided physical damage. We see that in the range of, $4 to $6 per dollar invested, depending on the study. But it's also those indirect economic effects. So avoided supply chain disruption, without adaptation, you see slower growth than you otherwise would, which trickles through the economy. So once you kind of look at the big picture, we see an extremely compelling business case for adaptation. And, Don spoke to some of those opportunities, ways to try and harness those benefits, which, are diffuse across society, but they're real and they're compelling. So I think it's a question of how do you harness those benefits? How do you monetize the benefits and channel them to the right actors to really get the investment going? But it is something that we can no longer afford kind of not to do systematically across the country. And yeah, I think, there's just a lot on everybody's plates, but as Julie said too, it intersects with vulnerabilities, with social vulnerabilities. We're not only talking about kind of hard infrastructure adaptation, reducing risks that way. We're talking also about reducing people's vulnerability to increasing extreme weather events. And there's a lot of things that governments at all levels can do that we don't necessarily think of as traditional adaptation in terms of improving the health and well-being. Some of our most vulnerable people, prioritizing lower income housing settings, for example, making sure that our health system is resilient. That's something obviously we saw in BC, that some of the most devastating impacts of the heat wave in 2021 were because of vulnerabilities in the health system itself that kind of broke down. So there's a whole range of actions that are needed, but we think it's a really compelling economic case.
Maybe just to supplement, if I could, and I agree with all of those points about, human vulnerability and community vulnerability and system vulnerability for important public services, like healthcare that are already under stress. And just to reinforce the point about economic resilience, a lot of the conversation so far is focused on acute climate risks in the context of disaster resiliency and disaster response. So after, during and after the fire or the flood. But long-term chronic climate risks are important to consider as well. And those would be, for example, long-term trends around moisture levels, long-term trends then knock on from that about food production, and even, where is your source drinking water going to come from in your community? So there are ultimately some long-term viability questions at stake for certain communities, both in terms of their core industries that depend on certain climate conditions, and also on the more fundamental level. And so all to say that it is going to be required, and communities are starting to do this already, but it is before too long going to be required for everybody, public and private sector, to consider and disclose those both acute and chronic climate risks through the IFRS standards related to Sustainable Accounting Board practices. And the acronyms keep changing. There's TCFD, there's SASB, there's ISSB, but it all becomes IFRS. We all know about IFRS, and IFRS is going to require disclosure and is building the protocols around this. So every one of our municipalities is going to have to know what those short-term acute risks are around disasters and those longer-term chronic risks to community. And I believe that the communities that have the best risk awareness and the best plans to attack that risk, to avoid all of those or as many of those long-term deleterious effects, are going to perform much better from an investment and growth attraction perspective than communities that either don't have solid plans to deal with those risks or don't even understand those risks. Because I think investors are starting to look. There's an interesting story I'll put in the chat. You know, Fannie Mae in the United States is starting to assess overvaluation in its portfolio of mortgages. And when the lenders start thinking about flood risk and fire risk and long-term availability of potable water in their lending strategies, you better believe that's going to have huge economic consequences for communities and for asset owners. And so getting ahead of this by really starting to understand what those risks are and putting plans in place sooner rather than later to meaningfully address them, I think is going to be actually a critical economic development imperative in the not too distant future. So it's one of those things worth thinking about getting ahead on.
Okay, thank you, Don. So our second question, Julie, so how does one become a champion for our colleagues who are risk averse, thinking particularly about small to medium-sized municipalities?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think at the root of all of this is understanding risks the way that Don has been explaining it. And there's an element of disclosure that is required here. So helping communities understand their risk, helping individuals understand their risk. And this is a place where we've really got a big gap in Canada. So not only do we not make our floodplain maps publicly available, there are some provinces where that is the case and the floodplain maps are pretty robust. But you can't just go and plunk your postal code into some app or website and find out what your risk is. So there's a disclosure gap right there. And I think that there's a number of organizations that are currently trying to tackle that and make sure that disclosure comes to the forefront. I know that there's Bill 56 in Ontario, which is aiming to make floodplain exposure mandatory in Ontario on an annual basis. So knowing your risk, really big. Number two is sort of reframing how we think about climate action and infrastructure. I know I've touched on this earlier, but you know, when we think about our community objectives around well-being, you know, really we want our communities to thrive and prosper. And some of the ways in which we already do that is, you know, we make sure that our drinking water and our sanitation systems, we invest in that kind of infrastructure to ensure that our citizens aren't getting sick. That is a direct outcome to health and well-being. And this is a similar kind of framing that we now need to be applying to climate resilience. We need to invest in the infrastructure at the municipal level, at the provincial level, at the federal level, all jurisdictional levels, in order to ensure the health and well-being of our population going forward. And there's, you know, obviously economic outcomes associated with that, like Sarah was mentioning. But really, we're going to be a healthier population. We're going to have greater well-being if we tackle this now. and we can't wait. Like, it's already here.
All right, you're so right, Julie. So thank you. So Dawn and Julie, if you want to kick in on this one as well. So how do we value natural assets? And can you speak a bit about natural capital and how it fits on a balance sheet or in a budget?
You know, it still doesn't fit neatly. There are a number of initiatives around this. It's one of the major gaps because we know that that nature is absolutely part of the answer, both for mitigation in terms of sequestration, but also for adaptation and resiliency. You know, there are a number of efforts around the world that are well backed by research and science that, for example, one of the best ways to deal with, you know, shoreline stability is through tree planting. So you can take a very hard engineered approach to, you know, attempting to hold back the water with a lot of concrete, you know, or you know, mangroves, wetlands, and shorelines that manage themselves through the web of life. If you can invest in them and be patient to allow them to grow, those can be much more resilient to weather conditions and changing patterns over time. And also don't fail catastrophically in the same way that built infrastructure does. So it's a very different risk profile. So intuitively, we know this, but translating that into financial value has been challenging. You know, putting a price on nature is a continuing piece of research work. But so far, the best examples of where it has been brought to bear is when a community, for example, Edmonton, our first look at upgrading our stormwater system to the storms of tomorrow was about $4.6 billion to do it the old way, with tunnels and a lot of concrete and a lot of hard infrastructure. And so if you've already mentally got yourself in the headspace that we're going to need to spend billions of dollars to deal with this known risk, if you've made that leap, and then you start looking at other solutions that involve nature, for example, more stormwater retention in the road right of way through tree planting, soil cells, and low impact development solutions, or greened acres. There's lots of different jargon for it, but essentially, you know, softening and creating sponges in the heart of your urban fabric, which has a bunch of co-benefits for shade, for evapotranspiration and antidotes to heat island. And we know that property values are higher where there are trees. I mean, once you start to tally all of that up, it's like, why weren't we always doing it this way, right? So, and here's the best part, that $4+ billion strategy went to $1.6 billion. So again, if you've already committed to having to spend a lot of money, and then you start thinking about how nature can be part of that solution and maybe make that solution work better than a hard, brittle infrastructure solution, then the case becomes self-evident. But getting to that in one move, instead of sort of having to design the base case that's very expensive and work back in, that's gray infrastructure, and work back into a mix of gray and green that's optimized, that's you know, I think there's more work to be done there. But absolutely, my belief is that nature has to be part of the solution, because it's better at this than we are, notwithstanding the best of our ingenuity. The things that we build don't last forever, but nature, put properly in place, sort of manages itself, which is inherently cost effective when you think about it. And
just to build on what Dawn is saying, I think you know, there's a number of different ways to look at this within a municipal setting. I'll give the case of Waterloo as an example, where we're bordered by the township of Wellesley and the township of Woolwich. And when we think about our watershed and how, you know, the uptown of Waterloo is literally on the floodplain. You know, like everything built out from a little mill pond, and there's a stream that runs down to the Grand River. And so there's a certain amount of, you know, flood vulnerability inherent to building in Waterloo. But when you think about the floodplain management from what's upstream in the watershed, it becomes really important to partner with your partner townships. And that's one way of doing it. The Lake Simcoe Conservation Authority came out with a paper, I think in 2021, which describes equity across watersheds. So that's one way to kind of look at it. The other would be to, I saw that Ingrid had put in the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, which is a Canadian organization that helps municipalities think about natural assets and how to go about incorporating them into your balance sheets. Part of that work is inventory. And so understanding what natural assets you already have becomes a really big piece of the puzzle. This is where we want to get at tree canopy. We want to look at, again, the watershed management to better understand the quality of our watersheds, where the natural filtration systems are happening. In terms of tree canopy, we have both public inventory, but we have private inventory. So how do we get at accounting for private trees and investing in the biodiversity of that tree canopy on private land? So, there's some initiatives there that need a lot of localization, but you have to kind of start with inventory. If you don't have inventory, you don't really know how to set your goals or what to work toward. But again, just going back to what Sarah was saying, this investment on the front end can be a 12-to-1 return on investment. Like it's really worth doing it, but you kind of have to shift your thinking about it. Just one last example. Just thinking about the Don Valley in Toronto, and if any of you have been to Toronto recently and just seen the sheer intensification, it's kind of mind-boggling. I mean, there's just so much built infrastructure so close to the lake and along the ravine system, and the naturalization that is going on in the whole reconstruction of the mouth of the Don River is a really interesting project. So I definitely urge you to look at how nature is being used in that context.
Thank you, Julie. So now I think we've alluded already to some of this, but Sarah, could you expand a bit on how do we make the business case for investing in climate adaptation? I know Julie's given us some good examples, but Sarah, can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think this has been touched on from a few different angles already. And I'll pass it over to Dawn here to expand on some of the practical examples as well. I think the key is, especially when you're talking about bringing in private capital, the key is really translating what we know are compelling economic benefits to the economy and to society and to people's health and well-being, some of which can be quantified and monetized, but translating compelling economic benefits into financial benefits, into benefits that work from a traditional finance perspective, and that to a large extent means cash flows. And I think that's something where there's no easy answer, but there are different ideas, some examples of things that are working, individual examples across the country and in other jurisdictions that really need to be scaled up through innovation, and I think in a mindset of kind of testing and figuring out what works and ensuring that there's really great accountability as you do that with your partners, but kind of taking a more innovative look at what's possible. So I would say really, really the key point, and there's a bunch of different, potential tools that can be used to get at this, but the key point is translating those economic benefits into cash flows that work for investors, and making sure as you do that, that the core purpose of improving resiliency for people in your community, ensuring equity considerations along the way are not lost. Dawn, maybe I'll pass it over to you. Sure, you have additional thoughts.
Yeah. So the sort of the king-sized example of this in Canada is the Red River floodway around Winnipeg, which was very, very controversial at the time. And in today's dollars, if you were to build it, it's about $1 billion a flood bypass to protect the city. And but it has been, according to the government of Manitoba, it has avoided losses to the tune of $40 billion. So, we talk about 10-to-1s and 12-to-1s and 15-to-1 paybacks. It's kind of the limit case example at 40-to-1. But there were people at the time who said you shouldn't build it, it's a waste of money, who would have been flooded 3 or 4 or 5 times since it was built. some to the point of devastation, right? And not able to get insurance anymore, not able to have business continuity. And that would have been billions out of that 40. But really it would have been federal and provincial disaster mop-up costs that represent the lion's share there. So we're all on the hook for those. Every time a community burns to the ground and has to be built back, every time a floodplain is ravaged and rightly or wrongly houses are put back there, or even if people are relocated to higher ground, those are all costs if they're non-insured, which non-insured losses are usually 3 to 4 times what the insured losses are. I suspect that number is going to get worse. And this is why there's a whole of society, a broad interest for all of us as citizens, all of us in this together, and all of us ultimately as taxpayers to get out ahead of this. But here's the best part. We don't have to find all $40 to pay the mortgage on, or pay the debt essentially on whatever the equivalent is to the floodway that your community may need. We just need to find a couple of those dollars over time. And you can find them directly, potentially, with large landowners who may be able to secure new investment or preferable lending because their risk has been reduced. They may be able to include in their investment model. We're looking at one example where there's a very large mall that's a part of that's implicated in some flooding in a certain area of a community. And we can maybe turn part of the parking lot there into a storage solution that serves both to de-risk the property as well as adjacent private residences. And so if you can make that worth the mall's time in terms of being able to say your insurance premiums will be lower and your case for investment will be higher and the losses to your constituent businesses will be lower, and actually start to model that at scale, that might be sufficient, even though there's an interest for the private business, private homes across the way, and even though there's an interest for the public school or the hospital down the way. You don't necessarily need to get all the partners to the table to harvest all $40. You can quit as soon as you have enough money to make the investment. So this will be about rallying different stakeholders to the table who understand their risk, because they're also on the private side having to do those risk disclosure exercises. And again, when their lenders and their insurers and their investors are starting to pay attention to where to deploy capital, it will become material to them to say, we have a known risk here. If we mitigate that risk with this infrastructure partnership, either on our own lands or meshed in with gray and green solutions with the municipality and a utility company and other public institutions, does all of that add up to a good investment for this community and for those stakeholders and landowners? The answer will very often be yes, because the alternative is unmanaged risk, which represents exposure to all of those other costs, both to them and societally. And so I think the logic of this is it's early days, but we're working hard to innovate those, closing those benefit loops and building precedent for the kind of stakeholder multi-stakeholder partnerships that will actually be able to harvest enough of that benefit to perhaps with some federal, loan guarantees and backing, other things potentially through the new GMF adaptation funds or through the infrastructure bank for larger projects at the scale of what needs to, what happened around Winnipeg. So there's still certainly a public sector role and opportunity to align with the National Adaptation Strategy, but it's actually going to be partners on the ground coming together to deal with an unmet need, just as cooperatives have been doing and municipalities have been doing, to deal with complex issues that don't stop at one person's property line or at the edge of the road right of way, but implicate all of us collectively.
Thank you, Don. So our time has gone by way too quickly. I know I had more questions. So I think we're going to have to move right to closing comments for this afternoon. There are some great resources in the chat as well if people want to take a look there. So we'll just go to our order and we'll go back to Sarah. You have each probably about 45 seconds to give us your key message that you want to deliver. Thank you.
Sure, I'll be quick. I'm just looking at David's comment in the chat, and he changed what I was going to say at the end here. I just to say, I think, yeah, that really resonates, sort of the emphasis on mitigation to date. And one of the things that we are really trying to emphasize, and that I think the National Adaptation Strategy is also starting to, shift the emphasis here to some extent, and recognize the imperative of adaptation alongside emissions reductions. I think, one of the things that has become clear, as Julie said, is these impacts are already here, both in terms of extreme events and also those more chronic impacts. And we've found that, as many scientists around the world have shown now, that even if we do our absolute best at reducing emissions extremely aggressively from now on and hit or exceed every target, we're still looking at substantial impacts, at least for the next 30 years. And it's really only after 2050 that changes in our emissions trajectory start to be material in terms of the risks that communities across Canada are actually facing. So I would say, to me, that is one really compelling argument for moving ahead on adaptation alongside emissions reductions in the immediate term as these impacts continue to manifest. And also just to thank you, FCM and everyone, for being here. It's been great to be part of the conversation.
Oh, we're so pleased to have you. Okay, Julie, about 30
Thanks so much.
seconds or less.
Yeah, just going to build a little bit on what Sarah's been talking about. So changing the scale of how we're looking at the problem. I mean, we as municipalities are at the heart of this. We're on the ground dealing with the delivery of infrastructure and services, and so thinking from that local level and the kinds of partnerships that need to be built out from it. Thinking in terms of our watershed level partnerships. What can you do with the community next door? And how can we just start to reframe this conversation so that we're thinking about it as an integral part of our investment in infrastructure going forward? And then we can start to pull in these other pockets of funding out there. And then just lastly, the three things have to go together. So we have to continue to work on mitigation. We have to be really bullish on adaptation to make sure that we're climate resilient. But the third thing is we also have to be drawing down. So we have to find all those ways, especially in our rural communities, where can we invest in the drawdown? And so agriculture has a huge role to play in this, just massive.
All right, thank you. So Don, 10 quick words. We're out of time. I need to pass it over to Andrea.
Yeah. No, as our CEO puts it, there's no transition to a net zero future without adding resilience as we go. If we make a brittle transition, the disasters alone will knock us off our net zero goals. So this is not an either or, it's very much a both and think about a building retrofit. If you deal with its energy efficiency, but don't make it flood resilient and heat resilient in the process, you put those mitigation investments at risk. So we need to do both. But that's what whole of society partnerships are good at. So thanks for being part of the conversation today, everyone.
Okay, thank you, everyone, our panelists, participants, and the FCM staff, and I'll turn it back over to Andrea.
Thank you very much, Councillor Jeffery, and thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Dawn, and thank you to the cooperators. It's without partners like the cooperators, it enables us to have these critical and complex conversations like the one we just had. So if your curiosity was piqued, if you're interested in learning more about this, I hope you will join us at FCM's annual conference taking place in Toronto from May 25th to 28th. You'll get to hear more from the cooperators on climate adaptation at the conference. Our staff from GMF, my colleagues, will be out in force. We will have a space in the trade show where you can learn more about GMF, learn more about the National Adaptation Strategy and the new streams of funding that will be coming online and that are currently available and will be available in the coming future. So I think my colleague Crystal's just dropped a link in the chat to the website where you can get information about how to register for the annual conference. And there's a lot of information and resources on the FCM website about everything we've covered in this session today. So thanks again to everyone for joining us. I wish you a great day ahead. Thank you.